Thanks everybody for showing up. This is a hybrid event and we have a crowd of about 500 in the auditorium today because we have a very special guest, Dr. Mark Clemons. Dr. Clemons is a staff medical oncologist in Ottawa, professor of medicine at the University of Ottawa, one of Canada's leading breast cancer researchers. So we're very fortunate to have him here today. For me, it's a great pleasure to welcome Mark because we're old friends, worked together at Sunnybrook for many years, squash partners. So it's good. It was good to catch up with him last night, and really looking forward to his talk this morning. Professor Clemons.
So thank you very much for that kind introduction. The audio is working. Okay. So bear with me while I get used to this oddness of the hybrid. I think there's been so few live events for so long. Getting back into the run of things. So I'm going to talk about real-world trials and the experience from the real-world cancer program. And there we go. Okay, so educational objectives. So by the end of this talk, you know my thoughts on the challenges of variability in care for patients, the state of trials in Ontario at the moment, and the Rethinking Clinical Trials program, which Kingston is a major player in. And the bit I added at the end was some of my views on investigator-initiated studies, because they have really taken a hammering during COVID, and things were difficult before COVID. So I'm going to talk about some traps that I'm aware of. This was the last time I spoke at this meeting. It wasn't virtual then, so back 6 years ago. And I talked about successful design and implementation. So it's nice to be invited back to say how this program's going, because at that stage you can see there are 200 patients on the REACT program. And a lot of what my talk was about was the barriers to clinical trial accrual. And sadly, here we are 6 years later, and the biggest barrier remains physicians not approaching their patients. It's not regulatory barriers, it's you in your clinic actually enabling the patient to participate in a trial. Disclosure slide, as Scott will tell you, I have no financial disclosures, but I have a driven desire to improve the treatment of cancer patients like all of us do. I also want to reduce variability in care. And so my simple mantra is, if you and I are doing something different, if you're right, then I must be wrong. So we need to answer these questions on variability and challenge therapeutic dogma, because, you know, as I approach the end of my career, dogma is still pervasive, and too many things that we do are not driven by evidence. And hopefully you would have seen the New England Journal article last week on the use of steroids in cancer patients with breathlessness. We all do it all the time, and they do nothing but harm. Yet I bet some of you in the clinics today will probably prescribe them, because I've continued to do so. So, variability in patient care. Why is it so common, and who cares? So the example I use is an MSU, midstream urine. We all see these all the time. You have an E. coli, it's fully sensitive, and so you have a range of reasonable choices, but which is the best? And this is where the eccentricities of physician decision-making come in. Physician choice. I've always given this antibiotic, that's the one I'm going to give. Which one can I spell? Now, some of you go, that's nonsense, Clem. No, some of these drugs are difficult to spell, so you don't give them. What dose can I remember? And I can say to anybody in this massive audience here, or even Scott, with his huge clinical practice, will be able to tell me what dose of ciprofloxacin is. What's funded? And by the time you work through these eccentricities, we often ignore the most important thing. Is the patient allergic to it? Then your decision-making processes are all backwards, our decision-making. Oncology perceives itself as being incredibly evidence-based compared to other disciplines, but oncology, there's still pervasive variability between the disciplines, surgeons, med-oncs, adjuncts, everybody, within individuals. And you know, there are some days you look at the chart and you think to yourself, what was I doing with that patient? Within the same center. So we know Dr. X running clinic at the same time as Dr. Y will be doing different things. And what one of my hopes is with the advent of social media, is that the patients will get a louder voice in it, because your patients are in the waiting room and they know Dr. X does such and such and Dr. Y does such and such. Before, there was no communication about that. They know this variability. Variability between centres. We know that certainly the Montreal centres do some things very different from us in Ottawa, only 2 hours away. Why is that? And obviously variability between countries. Many reasons for it. And variability in care is not good for patients, it's not good for the healthcare provider, and it is poor value care for the healthcare system. So why is it so common in oncology? Now, obviously, this is a med-onc example. So, for example, when we get a new drug approved, when it's developed at maximum doses and maximum schedules and evaluated in patients with very few illnesses. And we all know, once we get our hands on a new drug, we all start lowering the doses. We start giving it less often, and the agents still work because our way of developing drugs is totally wrong. And yet, we're trying to move away from the old maximum dosing model. We're not getting it. It should be efficacy dosing. It's interesting, though, but you have no regulatory approval when you're giving it at a lower dose, which, not great. Our research system is funded mainly on developing new treatment, not for comparing old treatment. So every time a new treatment arrives, we don't get rid of previous treatment, and you end up with multiple reasonable choices without ever knowing which is the best. And sadly, and I can sound a little bit bitter on this one, grant funding is mainly on new and exciting things. So when I put a grant in and the reviewer says it's boring, and they fund some molecular biology project that will help no patients, the model's wrong. The fundamentals of clinical care remain that a lot of the things we do in research don't help patients. So little interest in funding simple comparison of practical intervention. That could be nursing, pharmacy, med-onc surgery. The past clinical trial accrual is falling across not just Canada, but really the whole world. Less than 3% of adult cancer patients go on a trial. That number hasn't improved. Most of the trials that we do have are phase 1 and phase 2, and the chance of a patient benefit from either phase 1 or phase 2 trial are minimal. Despite great initiatives, and I was hoping in the audience I'd be able to see Janet Dancy, the 3CTN has been a tremendous initiative. Sadly, remains that most trials remain on pharma's mandate, and COVID and the transition to virtual care have made things even harder. It is more challenging to enroll a patient when you're speaking on the telephone or on a video conference. So the paradox. We have more patients with cancer. We know that our clinics are full. We know more about cancer than we've ever known. We've got more treatment. And even in GI cancer, they have more treatments that actually work. And we're spending increasingly huge amounts of money on these treatments. So despite this, we have very little guidance on patient-centered research, patient quality of life, optimal care when multiple reasonable options exist. And a very big interest of mine, another talk for another day, is the healthcare system, and that includes us, our sustainability, as we're all struggling in this quasi-post-COVID time. The present. So in 2014, REACT was created. The bottom slide, so Dean Ferguson is our head of our methodology, and so he's been doing pragmatic trials in hematology, blood transfusion for years. Lisa's my manager. Many of you here will know Lisa because she coordinates all the studies that we do. And Dave Stewart on the bottom right was the head of our med-onc division. And his greatest contribution, and this is not facetious, is he didn't get in the way. Far too often, our management get in the way of innovation, well, meaning maybe, but Dave just didn't, and he allowed the program to flourish. The challenge was no additional funding. And so often we see that you have great ideas, you want to do things, but it's on your dime. So REACT was created in 2014. And I'm going to now play a video, and I don't know if it's going to work, but I pushed the button.
I'm not sure if you're still trying, but I'm not seeing anything.
Okay. Stop sharing for a moment. Is this the slide you were on?
So,
Which slide were we on?
okay. Oh, what I'm looking at. There. Don't worry about it. It's just taking longer than the videos.
Sure.
You act the video out.
Could do, but I need a helper. Okay, I apologize for that. That's the marvels of modern technology. So anyway, if any, oh God, no, Scott's coming.
You know, on video.
There you go. It's working.
I apologize for that IT moment. So if any of you are bored later on, you can go onto YouTube and you can watch this video at your own leisure. So what are pragmatic trials? So explanatory trials are the traditional trials we've done in oncology, evaluating if efficacy of interventions in well-defined populations and in very controlled settings. The patients are invariably younger, richer, highly educated, and take less medication than the patients we see in clinical practice. And this patient group will always do better, irrespective of trial participation. Whereas pragmatic trials are more about testing the intervention in the broad routine practice that we're used to in our clinics. Before we do any REACT trial, we do a survey, and we've done surveys of thousands of patients and thousands of healthcare providers. Many of you in the audience hopefully have answered our surveys. And why we do the survey is essentially to see what is happening in very routine clinical situations. And what we find out every time is there is variability in everything that we do. We ask the respondents, be they patients, healthcare providers, what endpoints they think would be important for a trial. And we also use this evidence to go to Health Canada and say, even though there might not be a regulatory document, a product monograph for that, with that particular indication in, this is how your drug is being used in clinical practice. My begging is the usual, please answer your surveys. And if you don't treat the disease that we're surveying you about, could you please just reply to us? I'll be very, very grateful. We then do a systematic review. So a systematic review is a formal process where you review the literature, looking for trials, trying to answer the question you're looking at. Because you're trying to find out, has the trial been done before? If the trial's been done before, but the trial didn't work out, why didn't it work out? How can we learn from the experiences of others? And also, what are the best endpoints to study in a trial? To date, we've published multiple papers, and most of them have been led by fellows and residents. And Brian Hutton on the bottom left is our head of knowledge synthesis. And so we have a formal program for performing these systematic reviews, and we're always looking for reviewers. We then talk about designing the trial. So, can the trial be done? Will it accrue? Will it be done on time? Will it be done on budget? Now, these are all very logical things to all of you, but the vast majority of trials fail on these. Can we show the REB that there are multiple reasonable options available? So the trial is a very low risk study. We also want to have a trial where the results will actually change practice. Now, these are all very laudable endpoints, and you think you do this with every trial. It does not happen with the majority of trials. We then have a study lead, and I'll talk about study leads when we get to the investigator at the end. We then review the protocols again with Brian, Greg Pond, many of you know over at Master, amazing biostatistician, and we have an economist who also reviews the protocols. And then the team, the CRAs, reviews the protocol. And our rule of thumb is very simple. The protocol must become shorter and clearer with each iteration. This is not like traditional trials where it's like how many chefs are in the kitchen. Everybody's throwing their bit in there, and the protocols become longer and more difficult to perform. Traditional consent form paper, team, apparently that looks like me on the left. I'm talking to the patient. I page the CRA. The CRA comes and talks to the patient. The patient's given the 20-page consent document. The patient then has extra scans and visits and blood tests done. And then she's back with me to actually go on the study. It's therefore not surprising that every single step here leads to attrition and cost and the loss of real-world patients. Because real-world patients cannot make these multiple visits. They live too far from the centre, so you're getting a very biased sample. Some realities of the consent form. So I have a whole talk on this on its own if you ever invite me back. The reality is patients rarely read the consent form. And you all say, that's not true. Absolutely true. In fact, the patient who reads the consent form is a very unusual patient. And the reality is the consent form is not a legal document that you can hide behind. You still have to provide good clinical care. So a lot of people think, oh, it protects me from everything. No, it doesn't. And the sad reality is informed consent is rarely informed. It's not going to read a 20-page document, and it's rarely consent. And so the elephant in the room is exactly that. The way we've been doing this for so long, we've all used to comfortable with it, but it's not informed consent. So the integrated oral consent model is over on the right-hand side. So I talk to the patient the way I do in clinical practice. So we did a study with Kingston, looking at how many days of GCSF you should give. And I would say this is good clinical care. Most of us don't do this. Most of us just traditionally write, oh, I always write 5 days, or I write 7 days. Part of integrated consent is some doctors give 5 days, some doctors give 7, some doctors give 10. We don't know which is the best. Would you mind taking part in this study that's comparing them? The patient gets a single-page consent template with these major important things to do with the study. You dictate it, or whatever system you're using, so that becomes your source documentation. And often, if the patient agreed, randomization is done in the clinic, no additional clinic visits. We try to collect most of our data virtually through the electronic medical records if we can. And all of this we can do virtually. And so we were ahead of the pandemic in these processes. So you can see that since 2014, we have done a lot of trials. The photographs are there because you'll recognize Andrew Robinson. But you can see these trials are led predominantly by younger investigators, and that's what us old people should be doing. They should be the young folk coming through. There's med-oncs, there's rad-oncs, there's surgeons leading trials. We do trials from surgery, supported care and adjuvant trial, device trials, Andrew Robinson's trial, looking at central line use in breast cancer patients. They don't need them, even if they're HER2 positive. Why are people still doing this? Imaging trials, how often should you do ejection fraction for patients on trastuzumab? It's not every 3 months, every 4 months, it's absolutely fine. And palliative supported care studies. So interesting practical studies. We have 19 sites now across Canada. Saskatchewan's opening this afternoon. And I said, Kingston's been an absolutely essential and major player in this. So this is where we were at the end of the summer. You will see we're now over 4,000 patients, close to 4,200 now, and our accrual continued through COVID, because I think we were ahead of the game in the use of virtual consenting and having simple, practical questions. So it has been an amazing success as a program. What's impact? So this is where I start to irritate a few people, and Scott will tell you that's my forte. A publication in JAMA is not an impact. Does it impact on clinical care? A poster at San Antonio, the impact is minimal for the amount of work. Impact is how does it help us look after patients? So this is my trajectory of a breast cancer patient. I'm sorry, it's what I treat. So the top line shows, we did a randomized study comparing a very expensive dermal matrix with a less very expensive. They were absolutely the same. So we now use the less expensive. McGee, we showed that Oncotype is not needed for the vast majority of patients that you're ordering it. You are wasting taxpayers' money. We then did low-risk HER2, for low-risk HER2, comparing weekly paclitaxel with T-cyclone, trastuzumab, which was better, not the one you're giving, TC. The ones in red are the ones we did with Kingston, Hammersmith trial, GCSF trial. If a patient forgets to take their dexamethasone when they go to the chemo unit for docetaxel, they do not need IV. 8 milligrams oral, do not wait and treat. So we're reducing times in the chemo unit. RET is going to be announced at San Antonio. We randomized patients to start the endocrine therapy before the radiation for breast cancer or after. Most of us have been doing it after. Waste of time. You can start it before the RADs. No difference in quality of life, less visits to the clinic for the patient. And the bone-targeted agent, nobody should be giving selatronate with denosumab every 4 weeks for metastatic patients. We also did a trial with magnesium for patients getting platinum-based treatment. IV magnesium does nothing, yet we still keep doing it. So simple, practical things. The future. So that's the past, ongoing, my vision versus your vision. And this is for the folks who are moving into the fascinating world of investigator-initiated trials. So for me, treating breast cancer, every treatment I give is associated with benefit and risk ratios. And so on the left, you've got the PREDICT model for patient outcome, but that's easy. You've got to weigh this up against the toxicity of all of the treatments that we give. And I know that's common sense to all of us. For a patient, this young lad feeling dreadful on his chemotherapy, his quality of life is reduced, it's distressing to everybody. We have a support line in Ottawa, takes 5,000 calls a month from patients and their families. We know toxicity leads to more healthcare provider visits, unplanned clinic visits, increased use of the emergency room. And once you hit the emergency room, your risk of hospitalization is much higher, and potentially discontinuation of potentially useful treatment. And you guys know this. So why am I putting it up? Well, because this patient and their toxicity go to the white boxes. Depending who the patient or their family speak to, the recommendations for intervention for the toxicity vary and are often not evidence-based. So whoever they speak to will make a different recommendation. There's also no formal evaluation of, did we actually help the patient with that toxicity? Because when they come back to the clinic, maybe the toxicity is forgotten about, or you just keep going with the treatment. And so we end up with a system that rarely learns from every patient's experience. So the patient with this toxicity, their treatment goes on, and then the next patient starts. We don't learn. We don't practice as a learning system. And that's not just us, that's all of us in medicine. So, you know, we say we have many institutional strengths, but we're not actually improving care. So this is my interest in AI, and this will shock Scott because it's something to do with computers. I think we need to be integrating artificial intelligence and machine learning, and Khalid is the Canadian chair in medical AI. And we know that machine learning is where you can integrate complex relationships between variables, and an algorithm can often make a treatment prediction based on individual patient characteristics. And the fascinating book, and this book on the bottom right-hand corner, it was absolutely stunned me. So it talks about how terrible physicians and lawyers are at decision-making, and how we're so often wrong, and how we don't learn very well. Any algorithm will outperform a physician. There has not been an algorithm developed that did not outperform physicians. And that's not just because physicians were not very good at what we do. It just is a complex relationship. The way we learn as human beings, we're just reeking of bias. And so we never practice what actually is the best evidence out there. So it's a fascinating book. So the example I'll give is the Hot Flash project led by the crew on the top left-hand corner. Hot flashes are common with breast cancer treatment. They can be measurable. Different interventions are available. And so what we did was we've been creating a program where if the patient links in with a member of their circle of care with hot flashes, before we say to them, here's some venlafaxine, we get them to fill out a validated tool for measuring hot flashes. We then provide the patient with information on different treatment interventions, because despite the fact that physicians so often give venlafaxine, patients don't want venlafaxine. They want to do lifestyle intervention. They've had enough with all of these drugs that we give. So we give them this information, patient decides what they want to do, and then 6 weeks later, excuse me, sorry, we try to get them to complete the validated healthcare forms again, try and see, did the intervention make any difference? And the idea being that you would feed that information back into the EPIC system. So that project is ongoing. Where am I going with all of this? But what I really want is a project, is a series of projects where we use EPIC and MyChart. So you're not getting EPIC in it, but I don't know if your new system has. MyChart is the patient portal into EPIC. So your patients will be able to contact you one day. And the REACT program. And so the idea being is, can we have a learning system? So 3 projects at the moment. Hot flashes we just talked about. Different follow-up strategies. Many docs continue to follow up their breast cancer patients using standard ASCO guidelines, which do not reflect clinical risk. And that's got a project, we've got a randomized trial looking at how can we reduce the number of visits patients are making to the center. And we have a project we're actually working with Lois on, I hope, in Queen, where we're actually going to develop a strategy using clinical trial data to see Mrs. Smith with a 1 millimeter breast cancer does not require the same follow-up as Mrs. Jones, who had a 20 centimeter breast cancer and 10 nodes. Yet our system treats them both the same. Makes no sense. And so we've got this project running later on this year. It's actually going to go, Mrs. Smith, your risk of relapse in the next year is 0.001%. You don't need to see all your physicians. Your vision of your investigator-initiated research. Everybody says research is important. Everybody says they support research, and everybody says they want to do more investigator-initiated trials. As physicians, we're rarely paid to do research, and I don't know anybody who has protected time. Maybe you do here, but most of us, our patient volumes are expanding, and protected time is a luxury that doesn't happen. I couldn't run REACT without Lisa and her team, because there is so much administrative quagmire to spend your life working through. So Lisa keeps me in order for grant application. I love the delete button with emails. Lisa tends to keep things. She coordinates me, makes sure our consent templates are good, and ethics and everything's happening. Investigator-initiated research takes a hell of a lot of work. And so it is not for the faint of heart, and you have to get used to frustration. I think you have to be realistic. So if you want to lead a clinical trial, you have to be totally engaged. You have to answer your emails quickly and keep things moving forward. So if I email you and you reply a month later, that's really nobody benefiting from that one. We meet and discuss every single trial that we're doing every week. If you're in a clinical situation where you only see 10 eligible trials, that's a made-up number. It's going to be very difficult for you to lead and finish a clinical trial, but you could certainly help accrue patients to the trial. So I still see 230 consults a year. So I still run a large breast practice. So my rule of thumb is, if we're doing a clinical trial, can I accrue half the patients? Because then in my head, I know we will finish this trial. The other thing is, you've got to be open-minded about different clinical trial endpoints. Yep, you may well want overall survival in early stage 1 millimeter breast cancer to do a trial. Well, then you're talking 10,000 patients. It's not going to happen. So be open-minded about different endpoints, including quality of life, PROs. Nobody likes a trial failing, but get used to it. Resources. So we've done randomized trials for $20,000. That's £6. But realistically, you're talking 100,000 for a randomized trial. Our per case funding, as you guys in Kingston know, is low. But also the amount of work involved in doing the clinical trials should be low. These should not be long follow-up trials. Many of our trials get rejected by clinical trial managers because our per case funding is too low. But the reality is less and less trials are happening. We encourage people to apply for local grants. So if in Kingston you have a local competition that may bring in 20, 30,000, we can leverage on that. And 3CTN has been phenomenal, and individual patient donations. So an example would be, we've just finished a large randomized trial with Thunder Bay. They had a local competition for 50,000. Rebecca Auer, many of you will know, absolutely phenomenal surgeon. And so we have a grant, and we're looking at, Bob wants to do a trial in Booney Cancer Centre, and he doesn't have much support. And the idea would be that the doc will ask the patient, do you mind if we're going on a study, but Ottawa will contact you? So the idea being that you can put patients on trial and the patient is directly contacted by a central, it's called decentralized, but I think it's centralized. And therefore the CRA would be based somewhere else. This is very new and it's very early stages. And one of the challenges we've had is, if you're, let's say, a community surgeon and you want to do a trial, fantastic, but you still have to complete all the regulatory paperwork. There's no soft options here. This is too much. What can I really do? Well, we can all ask questions in the clinic. And I would always say, you know, if you're going to go to the clinic in a few minutes' time, why do we do such and such, and why does someone else do something else? Ask questions. Partner for React trials, my email, and you can have these slides, no worries about that. If you have smaller funds of money, you can do surveys, will help you. Systematic reviews, as I said, we always need reviewers. Decision aids, these are all things that can be done, investigator-initiated research, with smaller amounts of money. And you may well have a fantastic idea for a trial, but no support for it, and then we'll kind of help you develop the protocol. At the bottom right-hand corner, the surgeons in Toronto Sunnybrook have created the IMPACT program. And so this is very similar to React, answering simple surgical questions. And so the example that I always find shocking is perianal abscesses. Every day in every emerge in this country, somebody will be admitted with a perianal abscess. And the residents will tell you the management of this very common thing vary entirely with the staff surgeon that day. Stunning, because you're like, this is way more common than cancer, and yet this is going on. And so they're doing simple trials looking at, though that's one question. One is, you've had your belly operated on, just a cup of coffee the next morning, speed up the time for the bowels to start working again. So again, there's their website. They would love it if you contacted them. So on time, so all of you will get to your clinic, we come to the conclusions. So the past. Variability in clinical care is bad for patients, healthcare providers, and is poor value healthcare. Practice is often anecdote-based and not evidence-based, and too often we have multiple reasonable treatment options without comparative data of them. The present, REACT is generating evidence with the patient, and that's what the video is going to show, how patients and their family pretty well determine the questions that we do. REACT is not perfect. We still need phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 trials. Integrated oral consent is pretty well standard for everything we do, comparing standard care options. It's been amazingly successful for junior faculty for getting promotion, trainees. But the reality is research is hard and requires an incredible amount of commitment. The future, I think we need to change the way we practice, and we do all of this research. We need to integrate it into the system so that we learn from every patient's experience. COVID, you don't need me to tell, has been horrendously challenging, continues to be. Less patients are coming to the clinic, and so we're trying to collect data by phone and email, and consenting by phone or Zoom. Funding, the major barrier, it always will be. And organizations, we talked about this last night, including Health Ontario / Forward AB Cancer Care, need to decide if they want to invest in this, because these are huge amounts of taxpayer dollars being wasted that we could use to fund pragmatic trials. And REACT, I think, is a unique way for Canadians to work together to do really meaningful research that benefits absolutely everybody. The final slide. So we have 4,000 patients on clinical trials. We have 5 staff. We collaborate with multiple groups, and CCTG has been phenomenal for us. And with that, I'm going to stop. Scott is tidying himself up, and I'm not quite sure how you do questions, and I'll do whatever you tell me. So thank you very much, and I apologize for the video glitch.
We have one question, and that is, can the take-home findings of these trials be circulated to us in summary form?
So yeah, they're all on the REACT website, and so this is a really, I don't know where my ugly face is on all of and this is a real, so I'll expand your question. Yeah, go to the REACT website, they're all there, but it's something we've not been good at all. It's the KT. Oh God, that's what I look like. Oh dear. Is that what you do? Do you go, oh?
No,
No, he doesn't. But, Scott.
but I understand your reaction.
Is by the time you find the funding, do the regulatory, do the trial, write it up and publish it, we've all moved on with our lives. And so KT, which is the science of knowledge translation, knowledge mobilization, we have been an absolute disaster with. We have not been good at mobilizing these findings. We have gone to Cancer Care Ontario to try and present them, but again, COVID kind of made all of that very messy. So thank you, Heather, for the question. I've kind of expanded it to the sort of, I don't know how we do this better. And I would love it if one of you guys said, I'll become your KT lead. Scott kind of said yesterday, I don't know if it's what he said, do you use Twitter and things? And no, we don't. But yeah.
Well, I think Mark, you'd be perfect to start a REACT TikTok channel to disseminate the findings of these things. But I think, first of all, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, I'm old.
So first of all, thank you for a great talk. By the way, for those of you who aren't here, the crowd is absolutely going wild here.
It's hot,
it's incredible. It's really,
they're setting fireworks off. They're gonna.
It's pretty amazing. But Mark, I think I thought a lot about this. I've been working with the Cancer Care Ontario Guidelines program for a long time. You're talking. I mean, ultimately, trials. First of all, congratulations. Also, 4,000 patients randomized. That's really something to be proud of. It's amazing work. Trials, critical appraisal, but if it's not impacting patient care, we're not doing what we want to do. I think, so I think one of the ways is, you know, this idea of integrating it at the point of care, so that if a patient walks into clinic, and you had access to, you know, again, AI may be helpful here, and this is maybe a comment more than a question. This patient walks in, oh, did you know the result of the REACT BTA trial that could help you make this decision? But I think that's something we does need a lot of work, and I think given the information tools that we have, I think that's one of the options. So any other questions or comments for Mark?
Andrew's waving.
Andrew, Dr. Robinson.
Yeah, so first of all, of course, thank you for the great talk. Hybrid and live, both amazing. I thought there was room. Secondly, thank you for including us on these studies. But my question is, what's success look like for you? Is it REACT expands to be like the pragmatic clinical trial go-to in Canada? Is it multiple different copies in different areas, or what's the, let's say 20 years from now you retire, what's the vision for REACT?
So I'll repeat the question because that's the way technology happens. So what Andrew's asking is, so he would, first of all, he said, I'm the greatest person he's ever met. And I thought I was humbled by that bit. Then the next bit he said was, what do I see the future? What makes me happy? So I've had a number of health issues, and so I know my time is kind of limited, quality of life wise and the rest. So I've been in a very interesting phase during COVID of my major interest is mentoring and not seeking the glory that we all sought when we were younger, that Scott still seeks, never found, but still seeks. And so my interest has really become, how do you enable young investigators, younger than me, to develop an academic career and feel supported? So for me, that's really huge. If we can have a young investigator, shouldn't use that word, or whatever the term is, an investigator, and they can get a protocol through, we can find, and I'm willing to learn about the use of immunotherapy in lung cancer. If it helps design a study, I'm willing to learn about matrix use in breast reconstructive surgery, if we could design a study. So the most valued endpoint for me remains, when I'm in clinic, the findings of these studies invariably affect the care I give, and they invariably make my clinics faster and more simple, because every REACT, we haven't had a REACT trial that shows that more is better. Every trial shows that less is better for patients. So I would love hubs throughout the country, and because Kingston's been great, you know that, but it's how do we support people when there isn't much infrastructure, you're busy in the clinic, how do we do that? And I don't know the answer. That was a terribly long answer, but I want it to be pan-Canadian and practical.
That's great. I'm looking for hands, but if the other, yeah, oh, it was hard to see your hand, amid the crowd. But Dr. Mathis has a question. Please go ahead.
Have you looked what impact the REACT studies have describing practice? Your way to look like once REACT is published, you know, people change practice.
So Dr. Mattis has a question, is do you have any idea of the impact of these trials on actual prescribing or practice in Ontario?
Right. So it's a great question. I know, and the video shows you, we have saved millions in Ottawa. Now, Ottawa is probably one of the largest single-site cancer centres, and everything says they are, don't they? So we see 1,000 new breast cancer patients a year. So we're huge. So we have saved millions. GCSF use. 10 days used to be the standard. Some people used to do 7. Now it's 5. Then peg-filgrastim came in. We have a trial running at the moment comparing peg with filgrastim. Denosumab every 12 weeks. We have a trial at the moment looking at, once you've done 2 years of bisphosphonate with denosumab for prostate or breast, every 6 months. trials ongoing, because these drugs are not doing anything, because our anti-cancer drugs are so much better now. And as you know, the half-life is seladronate for the decade. Why on earth would anybody be giving it every 4 weeks? You know, so it's huge saving. The challenge is finding economics, or it's not called economic, healthcare value, whatever this week's term is, because we have a great training program in Ottawa, but as soon as people finish the training program, they get poached by Health Canada or pharmaceutical companies, because they're incredibly, so it's very difficult to keep them in the healthcare system. So if there's somebody who's listening who's a healthcare person, economic person, and wants more work, we have tons of data. We collect economic data on all of our trials. Great question.
I'm just looking through for hands or questions, but also please feel free to put a question in the chat. I'm surprised there's not more questions from this incredibly large crowd here, but I guess everybody's shy. Okay, well, Mark, that was a great talk. Very thought-provoking. Thanks for including us in the REACT program, and we hope to be continued contributors. And congratulations on on such an innovative and meaningful clinical trials program. Thanks for coming to Kingston, and thanks everybody for tuning in today, and thanks for the 500 people here in the auditorium.
Can you exit from the front rows forward, please?
In an orderly fashion. Sorry.
It's like Air Canada. Will you take your things out of the?
Okay, thanks very much, and have a good day, everybody.